You've noticed your high street falling to bits, your councils run out of money, and the factories and the mills are long gone. This was caused by austerity. But where did that come from? And why are you suffering from it? This wasn't stumbled upon by some think tanks or some policy wonks accidentally. This was tested extensively on all of these countries, long before it started to impact your life. In this video, I'll explain where it started, who was doing it, why they were doing it, and most importantly, how our politicians learnt to use it on you. We're talking about structural adjustment programs. So what is a structural adjustment program? As a response to the debt crisis in the 80s, it was a combination of an appreciating dollar, collapsing commodity prices, and sweeping changes to the global economic system. Structural adjustment programs were measures implemented by the World Bank and the IMF on much of the global south. That is, Latin America, Africa, and most of Asia. These were a series of conditional loans given in return for changes to international and domestic policy. Conditional in the same way that a mob boss tells you he'll protect your shop, and if you don't pay him, he sends his boys in to smash it up. These conditions had profound effects, not only on the countries they were imposed on, but on the global world order, the global economic system, and the future of capitalism. They deepened globalization, they worsened inequality, they increased the rate of resource extraction from the global south to the global north, they increased the rate of capital flight in the same direction, and finally, it paved the way for austerity in the global north, in particular in the UK. The conditions of these loans can be split into three broad categories that consist of 10 key points, broadly known as the Washington Consensus. Fiscal discipline and markets. Tighten your belts, focus on development rather than consumption, cut taxes, and don't intervene in interest rates. Let the private sector do that. That's the first four. Then we've got investment and liberalization of trade. So let the market decide the exchange rates. Import and export freely. So have no state restrictions on what can come in and go out. And let foreign capital invest freely wherever it wants in your country and infrastructure. The third section, privatisation and deregulation. So let the private sector do it, not the government. Let finance move in and out of sectors quickly and cheaply. Cut the red tape. And finally, protect the assets. Because you can't grow and you can't develop if people are trashing your factories and your mines. Altogether, this is what became commonly known as the Washington Consensus. Some of these may sound like common sense, right? Some even look quite familiar. Invite investment, reduce poverty, increase development, increase GDP, increase growth. That all sounds great, no? And you'd be forgiven for thinking that these were in the interests of the countries that they were prescribed to. But when you look at the reasons why and the outcomes of these prescriptions, the picture starts to change a little bit. So, why were structural adjustment programs implemented in the first place? What motivated two organizations like the World Bank and the IMF send a little guy to rock up at these countries with his little briefcase and prescribe what ended up being incredibly harmful and destructive measures on these countries in the global south? What incentive did they have to do this, even though they were so harmful? I'm going to talk through the incentives that the global north had to prescribe structural adjustment programs so broadly all across the world. There are 5 key reasons, each one informing the next. And once you know all 5, it's easy to understand why these measures were implemented in the first place and what motivated it. Firstly, neo-imperialism, or economic imperialism. Following World War II, the European empires had mostly collapsed, and there was a wave of decolonisation all throughout the world as the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, and much of the European empires lost their colonies, one way or the other. Countries all over the world had gained their independence, and they wanted state-led development for their people. Left in the ruins of a post-colonial country, they had limited infrastructure, limited forms of government, and limited means by which to do this. One of the ways they could do this was take on huge amounts of debt. As we noted at the start, once the global economy changed and the price of the dollar spiked and commodity prices went through the roof, suddenly these debts became unmanageable. In stepped the IMF and the World Bank to kindly help out. Unable to control old colonies directly, the IMF and the World Bank essentially took control of the economies of much of these countries in the global south and implemented measures ultimately designed to align these countries with Western economic doctrine and bring them into a globalized economy. This allowed Western companies to move in. They now had new markets to sell their products. Number 2, they needed to expand Western markets. Because capitalism is driven by the growth imperative, Eventually, your middle class and your lower classes can no longer sustain consumption. Companies are running out of demand. This means we need new markets. Population growth had stagnated in the global north, and as standards of living increased, companies were running out of demand. By allowing huge influxes of foreign direct investment into these countries, they essentially open up their markets for development. Huge multinational companies benefited by setting up shop in these post-colonial countries that had had structural adjustment programs imposed upon them. Now, in order to keep up with the excess production, these companies also needed access to more resources, which brings us to the next reason. They needed ways to extract more resources from the world. To maintain control over natural resources such as minerals and fossil fuels, they had to ensure free access of their companies to the places where these resources exist. By using Western multinationals to set up shop in these countries, they allowed direct capitalist control of these countries' resources and maintained control of them within the Western sphere of influence. And this keeps resources out of local hands. This creates, in turn, a huge windfall in capital that's then extracted and sent to the global north. Which then, what do you do with your big pot of gold? You need a home for all that excess money, what we call capital surplus, to be reinvested. So each country effectively becomes a new investment opportunity. As Western multinationals move in to set up shop and extract resources, they need all the infrastructure that comes along with that. They need roads, they need ports, they need housing, they need markets, they need shops, they need products. And suddenly now there is a whole host of options for capital to invest to get its returns. Companies in the global north can now dump all their surplus capital and get their returns. One key thing to understand here is we call, in this context, the global north the imperial core. Now, I know they're not directly colonizing these countries through imperialism, but they are subjugating them economically. The countries that they're doing it to in the global south, we refer to as the periphery. And this is an important distinction to understand, as the periphery exists to serve the core, and the core will do everything it can to extract wealth and to extract resources from the periphery to maintain standards of living in the core. This is how global inequality comes about and why it gets worse. And there is a final point here that structural adjustment programs helped with, and that is fighting communism. The backdrop to all this is the West has been engaged in a Cold War with Soviet Russia since the end of the Second World War. As countries decolonized, they wanted to maintain state control over their resources, over their capital, and they wanted to improve lives for their own people. This led to introduction of socialist policies in these countries that were designed to help those countries and not have all their resources and capital continually expropriated into the imperial core. That meant stimulating production rather than importing. It meant high tariffs on imports. It meant keeping control of natural resources such as fossil fuels and minerals to be used internally, and it meant trying to stimulate an economy that could provide a good standard of living for their own people. Additionally, there's always the risk that the Soviet Union could come along and do something similar, and the West didn't want that to happen. Structural adjustment programs are neoliberalism laid bare. They're designed to turn the rest of the world into extraction sites for the imperial core. If you made it this far, thank you so much. I hope you're really enjoying the video and you're finding it useful. If you want to help me grow, you can do so in a few ways. First and foremost, make sure you hit like and hit subscribe and share this with your friends. Secondly, you can follow me on TikTok and on Instagram. Finally, head over to my Substack, where I do deeper dives and add supplementary information to the videos that I make. I'd love to do this full time, and you can help me by doing that by buying me a coffee. All the links are in the description. Thanks again. Hope you enjoy the rest of the video. So we've seen what these policies are now in detail and why they were implemented, but the way they played out in reality differs from country to country. They led to different outcomes and in turn different problems for each country depending on the nuance of that country's setup. In particular, what access to commodities and natural resources that country had available to it, and what infrastructure was already in place when the little fella from the IMF and the World Bank came along with his little briefcase. I'm going to talk you through one example, that is Nigeria. And you can see the impact that it had not only on the government and the economy, but also on its people. And you'll start to see how our politicians learned from this experiment. After independence, Nigeria invested heavily in its own infrastructure, its industry, its agriculture, and in particular, its oil sector, and enjoyed the benefits of being oil rich. But in the early 1980s, the revenues from oil collapsed. Foreign exchange rates plummeted, manufacturing fell to bits, Unemployment soared and debt skyrocketed. Nigeria is an example of a country with so much potential. So where did it go wrong? Well, it was the collapse of global oil prices. A lot of the countries in the global south relied on one key export that propped up much of their economy, which meant that they were vulnerable to global shocks in the prices of those commodities. And when they went up, the country was doing great. When they went down, not so much. This created fertile ground for the IMF and the World Bank sending their little guy with his little briefcase and explore a few policy options. The IMF and the World Bank turned up promising economic stability and a magic word that everybody loves, growth. Policies included devaluing the currency, cutting government spending and liberalising trade, privatising state-owned firms that were working in the country's interests, and promoting more industrialisation. To begin with, it looked like it was working. GDP growth started to rise, and investment in Nigeria increased significantly, but deeper problems started to emerge. Unemployment worsened as public sector jobs were cut, manufacturing suffered because they were forced to import expensive raw materials, and local farmers lost access to their profits due to subsidy removals. Inflation surged. This led to wealth concentrating at the very top, savings falling, and many young Nigerians left for better opportunities abroad. They call this the brain drain. Meanwhile, as a result of these changes, an already exposed economy became even more exposed to global markets and shocks. These programs had deepened the very problem they were put in place to solve. That's not to say that it was all failure. Some sectors, such as textiles, paints, and synthetic fabrics, improved, but overall, structural adjustment programs had failed to diversify Nigeria's economy away from their dependence on oil. Manufacturing still remained only a small share of GDP and exports. Small businesses were now having to compete with multinational corporations and they were struggling, and unemployment remained stubbornly high. The evidence shows that while mismanagement and political pressures definitely exacerbated the problem, the core problem was Nigeria's structural dependency on the global economy. And this was something that structural adjustment programs actually made worse. So you may be wondering how economic and political policy change in oil-rich Nigeria impacts you. But these policies made their way from Africa to our towns and cities like Grimsby, Rochdale, Bradford, Newcastle, via our political class. To understand this fully, we need to now go on a journey of austerity through the UK. We need to understand what it is in theory and understand the material conditions that were in place that led to austerity being implemented in the UK. We need to know why it came about and how it played out in practice. To get there, we need to understand how the British elite, our politicians and our leaders learn their policies, how they are raised, the education they receive, and the information they use to make decisions. We're going to call this the core learning from the periphery. And we have to understand Britain's historical role as an empire and how they manage their empire. So for the core, what are the benefits of empire? Resource extraction, cheap or even free labour, luxury goods, lands, access to natural resources, but also, and this often goes overlooked, ideas. The centre of the empire can treat the edge of the empire as a sandbox. And in that sandbox, they can apply a test and learn approach to a whole raft of things, from science to military tactics to political policy. This continues long after the colonialist power has left the colony. We call this neo-imperialism. So let's just look at one quick example of ways in which the imperial core are able to learn from the periphery. A good example of this is quinine. European empires were being struck down by malaria, and in the 19th century, they adopted practices from their colonies in order to protect themselves against tropical diseases. Quinine is a treatment for malaria and was first used by indigenous communities in South America. This led, in 1899, to the establishment of tropical medicine with institutions like the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Here, they were able to study diseases like yellow fever, malaria, and sleeping sickness. This is one quick way that an imperial core can learn from its periphery. We go into their space, we encounter their problems, we can take that back to our safe space and we can learn from that. This transforms health standards both in the core and in the periphery, but is built upon colonial extraction of ideas. So, what do structural adjustment programs in the periphery teach the imperial core about governance, economics, and policy? Firstly, we get well trained in how to extract local resources and how to move wealth from those resources upwards. In that case, back to the imperial core. Widening inequality leaves big gaps for new markets to open. Cutting back public services means private monopoly over markets, institutions, and state affairs increases. This continues to concentrate wealth upwards. And finally, they learn how to package this and sell it to the public. Back then, they can step into a debt-ridden country and say, hey guys, don't worry, we've got the solution. Just look at the way we live. We've had debt, but don't worry about it. We put these measures in place, everything will be fine. You just come into our way of thinking and you'll be all right, don't worry. It teaches them the right language and the right approach in order to convince an ex-colonial settlement to re-accept a form of colonialism. It helps them to frame economic policy around a concept of scarcity, real or imagined. So we've seen how structural adjustment programs can teach those that implement them about their outcomes and their effects and the way that they're understood and the way that they're accepted. They see what happens when you cut public spending, you cut back state infrastructure, you liberalise trade, and you liberalise investment. And they see what happens when you deregulate and globalise local markets, which we concluded probably wasn't good for anybody. So why would an idea like this make its way into the UK? Why would the imperial core take the methods it's used to subjugate the periphery and apply it on its own people? And if it was so bad, why would they think it would be good for us? The data from structural adjustment programs is clear. It does not affect human outcomes in a positive way. And surely they could see that austerity as a response to debt and doesn't have a significant increase in human metrics. To understand why they would do this, we need to understand our governing elites better. We need to understand where they come from, what ideologies they're steeped in from birth, and what they learn at school, and what they think about the world and how they apply that to governing their own countries. And then we can see how ideas like this manage to make their way from Nigeria all the way to you. Whoa, you really are sticking around. Thanks again for getting this far, and I hope you're really enjoying it so far. Here's just a reminder of a few ways you can help me grow and support me. First and foremost, make sure you hit like and hit subscribe and share this with your friends. Secondly, you can follow me on TikTok and on Instagram. Finally, head over to my Substack, where I do deeper dives and add supplementary information to the videos that I make. I'd love to do this full time, and you can help me by doing that by buying me a coffee. All the links are in the description. Thanks again. Hope you enjoy the rest of the video. We're all broadly familiar with Eton, and we know who comes out of there. They're factories for the British elite. History, empire, economics, all taught as if the periphery exists to be experimented on. Leaders like David Cameron, George Osborne, Boris Johnson, they grow up learning this is how the world works. They grow up born to rule. The periphery exists to be exploited, and so do the poor. They see the world in these terms. They come from old money, old families, families steeped in imperial ideology, families stretching way back. The sorts of people that they mingle with, grow up with, and spend time with were descendants of the people who were managing these colonies long before they became decolonized. And this applies the most to the Conservative Party, particularly the brand of the Conservative Party that we got post-2008. Austerity in the hands of the Conservatives was probably the worst version of austerity we could have got. Just to be clear, this is not a uniquely British problem. Austerity was implemented worldwide post-2008, but the focus here is on how it was applied in Britain specifically, and how it was applied to you, because it's different and it's important. So, what do our elites learn from experiments like structural adjustment programs in places like Nigeria? They learn that these things are bad for everyday people, but they're great for business, trade, globalization, local elites, wealth concentration, resource extraction, capital flight, geopolitical advantage, and learning how to garner public support. It gave them the playbook to continue extracting resources and wealth from the periphery. Now, they don't need armies, they don't need guys in red coats on horseback, they just need some guy in a suit with a briefcase telling these countries they can help them escape the very debt trap that the country they represent put them in. So, we've learned what structural adjustment programs are, we understand how the imperial core learns from the periphery, we know how structural adjustment programs were implemented, why and who by, and to what end. And we understand the lessons that the British elite took from this experiment. We still need to understand why they would take what are effectively neo-colonial and neo-imperial practices and apply them on their own people in the core. Because surely the point of any empire is to maintain high standards of living in the centre of the empire. To understand that, we need to learn what austerity is, how it's implemented, and the material conditions that precede it. and understand why this was a viable option to be implemented in the UK. So let's start with the why. Let's look at the material conditions that preceded austerity in the UK. Following the fallout of 2008 and the dramatic collapse of the world economy, governments across the world were bailing out their banks, bailing out their financial elites using public money. This led to a humongous increase in public debt. No more so than in the UK. So, the British elite do what elites do best. They never let a good crisis go to waste. And they took this as an opportunity to cut back. But what if I told you it was more than that? This is also part of a wider strategy by the British Conservative Party to continue to shift the Overton window to the right. The Overton window is what we use to describe the landscape of political ideas. It's what is politically acceptable in any given zeitgeist. Whether it shifts right or shifts left has huge implications for what policies will be accepted by a population. The Conservative Party wanted to cement a legacy from their own past and use that to begin further erosion of social safety nets in this country. And we're still paying for this now, 15 years later. So, why was austerity implemented? 1. The Conservative Party wanted to build on Thatcher's legacy of society and the economy. Cameron and Osborne were building on decades of British conservative thinking. When they implemented austerity in 2010, they were doing this on the back of Thatcher and Reagan, who had laid the groundwork for deregulation, privatisation, cutting public spending, advocating for small government, and financialisation. Austerity is a logical conclusion to this. Number 2, they want to permeate the myth of the household budget. The UK generally, thanks to our education system, has quite poor economic literacy. As a result, our media landscape steps in to fill that void. And so do our politicians. And they have permeated this myth of the household budget over and over and over. Here's a description of why that's wrong. This idea is both preceding and supporting of austerity. If you believe that the government should run a country like you run your house, concepts like austerity become very, very relatable and they become easy to understand immediately, which is great for a political platform and great for policy. Finally, they want to consolidate wealth. Austerity isn't just about cutting spending. As we saw in Nigeria, it's about transferring public assets and public wealth into private hands. Hospitals, railways, public services, they all become new opportunities for profit and wealth extraction, funneling wealth upwards while the public absorbs all the costs. So, we know about structural adjustment programs, why they were implemented and how. We understand how our elites learn from this and how they build on decades of ideology to eventually land during a crisis at a very specific outcome. But as a cold hard policy, as far as the global north is concerned, what actually does austerity mean? And how do you implement that, and what other policies do you need to run alongside it to make it as effective as possible? So that brings us on to the final point. What actually is austerity? Austerity is understood broadly as reducing public debt. It's cutting back, tightening the belt, whatever other outdated way of explaining it you want to see it as a way of reducing the outgoings so that we can balance the books. However, as a broad economic policy, it requires some other bits to go alongside it in order for it to work effectively. You have to be fiscally disciplined, which means removing subsidies. You have to ensure a broad tax base, which largely means tax cuts, usually for the wealthiest. You want positive interest rates to stimulate debt. And you want to promote foreign direct investment in your economy. You want to deregulate your private sector, because as public spending draws back, the private sector needs to pick up that slack. And the quicker and the easier they can do that, the more effectively it happens. And you want legal security for all your property rights. You want your asset owners to continue owning their assets. And finally, you want freedom of trade in and out. You don't want any tariffs, and you want full trade liberalisation. Doesn't that sound familiar? Let's go back to the start. So we've got fiscal policy discipline, redirection of public spending from subsidies, broadening the tax base, market-determined interest rates that are low, competitive exchange rates, trade liberalisation, liberalisation of inward foreign direct investment, privatisation of state enterprises as much as possible. We want deregulation, even though deregulation is what put us in this situation. We don't want to tie their hands too much, they want to be free to do what they want. And we need legal security for our property rights. Point by point, this is a structural adjustment program. Don't matter how you spin it. We had structural adjustment programs in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and following the collapse of the global economy in 2008, we were put in the exact same situation that the global south was in following the shocks of the 80s. So what did? We did what we knew best. We applied a structural adjustment program on our own economy. because we've seen firsthand the benefits it has for business, for finance, and for the wealthiest. And we've seen that people will take it, and the impacts on our country have been huge. We've seen the same outcomes that were seen throughout the global south in the 80s. We've seen huge privatisation of our public services, which have crumbled. Liberalisation and financialisation has led to a credit-based economy with low interest rates, stagnating wages, and a heavy reduction in manufacturing and blue-collar work. And we've seen huge instances in inequality just increasing over time, ever since 2008. Because of cuts to public services, assets go into private hands, those assets hugely appreciate in value, and inequality gets worse. This is exactly what happened in the 80s to the global south. It's important to note that austerity is not uniquely British, but the brand of austerity that we got was very uniquely conservative. So you see how we come full circle. You see how the imperial core extracts wealth and resources from the periphery. You see how it learns from that, and then when it gets itself into the exact same situation it put the South into, it applies those very same practices on its own people. Only it can do it more effectively, and it can do it with institutions and with language packaged in a way that people will accept, because they've learned how to do that already. They learned how to do that all over the world, in Latin America, most of Asia, and most of Africa. You're seeing your living standards decline as the empire turns inward on itself, as the periphery becomes less and less valuable and the core becomes more and more unstable. The boundaries of that core get smaller and smaller and smaller. And our quality of life is diminishing now as a direct result of that. We've come full circle. So, from Africa, Asia, Latin America, to the streets of your town, the story's the same. Our governments and the elites, they test policies on the imperial periphery first. Structural adjustment programs, whilst implemented by the IMF and the World Bank, still taught the imperial core a lot about particular economic and social policies and the impacts that they have, rightly or wrongly. Austerity is not an accident. It's also not purely a domestic choice. It's our government and all the other governments in the global north applying the lessons that were learned in the global south. Our government were deepening the policies that they played with in the 80s under Thatcher, showing that the core always learns from the periphery and not in a way that serves you. We were in this same situation as the global south, and our elites responded in the exact same way. This should act as a warning. This same logic can apply to future policies unless we pay attention and we learn. And we need to question whose interests are being served and think about alternatives. If our elites can learn from the periphery, and so can we. We can learn about alternatives, and there's plenty of them. Community-led developments, different forms of democracy, different forms of social and economic organisation, different ways to invest public money, and different public policies that put people over profit. You just won't hear a lot about them because a lot of those places are getting choked out by the core. But awareness is the first step toward change. Every vote, every protest, every conversation that you have matters. Policies like austerity are not inevitable. They are political choices made by people. They're not rules of nature. Knowing this history gives us and you the tools to affect change and do something about this. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe, share this with your friends. Check out my Instagram, check out my TikTok, and head over to my Substack to read and learn more. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this and what your experience is with austerity. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.